Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our class. This is a class which will have a discussion about the technical aspect of the Omer period. So the period of the Omer extends from the second day of Pesach till Shavuot. There are two specific sacrifices or events which happen in the temple period, which relate to this, and that is the idea of bringing grain sacrifice. One called the Omer, which is on the second day of Pesach, and the other one called the Shtei HaLechem, the bringing of the two loaves, which happened in the Shavuot period. So the Mishnah is our laws, which are explained in the Mishnaic texts of the oral law, explain the prohibition of eating from the new grain till the Omer sacrifice is brought. Now, when we say the usage of the word sacrifice, and we've discussed this before, that a sacrifice doesn't necessarily mean an animal sacrifice. It is a process. The Korban, the idea of a sacrifice, is the idea of bringing something to the temple, and it might be a vegetable-based product, a grain-based product, and it might be an animal or a bird-based product, which is acting as the object which you bring for the purposes of sanctifying God's name, for the purposes of God in the temple. Now, in this particular case, remembering that Pesach is spring is just at the time when the new produce is sprouting. In the agricultural sense, this normally refers to the first produce which comes out of the agriculture, the first grain which comes out, and the first produce which is brought to the temple at the Omer period is a barley produce. Now, what the first barley produce of the grain of the oats is that of the Omer is the job of that thing is to, once the Omer is brought, we allow the usage of grain products to be used for the personal usage of people. So till this point in time, any new growth of grain is to be held in your storehouse or within the field. You're supposed to use your existing product, and the new produce that's grown in the field awaits its permissibility to be able to use in your life till the Omer sacrifice is brought. So since this happens in spring, this is the first time. Normally, this is the first growth which just appears in the field. It happens at that time, and the first produce which normally comes out is the early budding grain. And now the Mishnah talks about that the sacrifice of the Omer. I'm quoting a Mishnah in Gemara Menachos 68b. Sacrifice of the Omer offering would permit consumption of the new crop. Now, the new crop for non-sacred purposes, and the two loaves offering, which happens at the Shavuot, at the Festival of Weeks festival, they permit usage of new grain or the new crop for usage in the Beis Hamikdash. Hence, one is not allowed to bring the meal offering from the new crop prior to the sacrifice of the Omer. The meal offering means it's the grain-based meal offering, and one does not bring it prior to the sacrifice of the Omer. And if a person did bring the meal offering at that point in time prior to the Omer sacrifice, then their offering is considered possible and is considered unfit. Once the Omer sacrifice procedures has been done, and even prior to the 6 weeks, the 7 weeks later of the offering of the new loaves, one may not bring the new produce as part of your meal offering. But if it was used for any purpose, it's considered fit and usable. But one shouldn't do it at first. Now, that is the rules which relate to the two offerings that we've just described: the Omer offering and the Shtei HaLechem, and the two loaves which are brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Conceptually, we can try to understand what is it that this achieves. What does the offering of bringing of the Omer achieve, and what sort of model or what sort of framework of rules should we understand the rules that we just said it? Why is the new grain disallowed prior to the Omer offering, and why is it why is that in the period of in between, for personal use it's always allowed, but for sacrificial use, for use in the temple, it's considered not the most appropriate thing to do, but if you did it, it's considered okay. And why is it only permitted after, or fully permitted after the two loaves have been brought? So our authorities provide three frameworks of looking at this law. First framework, the idea that the prohibition against consuming the new grain really needs to be viewed on two planes. On one plane, it's the private person's usage, and the other plane is the idea that it can be used or it's not to be used in the temple. And those two aspects are two particular subtopics in the one idea that we shouldn't be using this grain until the two loaves are offered. So from the point of view, we try to understand it. It is essentially the same prohibition. However, the reason why a sacrifice made after the Omer, but before the two loaves has been permitted, after the fact brought after the fact it's considered okay, is because the Omer has already, once I've brought the Omer sacrifice, that in some way has permitted the new grain, even though it's only in one context, that is in a private person's usage or private consumption, and any remaining leftover prohibition of the new grain is only for sacrifices, and therefore, because of that, the prohibition has been weakened somewhat, So ideally, in the ideal case, using the first framework we're discussing, that it's really one prohibition that's got two time periods associated. So ideally, it's only fully permitted to be used in the temple after the two loaves have been brought. But since it's already been partially permitted for private use after the Omer game, so therefore the prohibition aspect has been somewhat relieved, and once it's been relieved somewhat, it's allowed to it's allowed to continue. Okay, so that's one aspect of the framework. The second way to understand it would be that the prohibition against offering the new grain is, in fact, two strong differentials, and the two prohibitions are two distinct prohibitions. Yet, since the Torah did not repeat the idea that it's prohibited to use for sacrificial purposes, it seems that you could understand it that it's not actually binding after the fact, but only before the fact. That is, in its own, even though it built in the second prohibition that it only applies before the fact, but after the fact, in other words, once it's been used, it's basically okay, and it's therefore we understand the prohibition of using grain, the new crop or the new grain in the Omer period is inherently a lesser degree of prohibition than the consumption of the new grain if the offering hasn't been done. That is, the offering of the new grain before the Omer is disallowed even after the fact. But since an offering must be fit for the consumption of a Jew, and the new grain is not yet fit for consumption, so prior to that it's not allowed. But once it became fit for a Jew to eat, even in the private domain, then it's now allowable in some respects for temple usage. So that's his other way. But really, we see it as two distinct, two different prohibitions. There's a third model that we can understand this prohibition about, and that is that the two offerings which permit the new grain function in two different ways. So the two offerings, that is the first offering, which is called the Omer one, and the second offering, which is the one of the two of the Shtei HaLechem, of the two breads, they actually function in two different ways. Prior to the Omer, it's forbidden to eat the new grain whatsoever, and the Omer is acting as a permitting capability. Right? So it's actually what's called, in the technical references, it's called a Matir. It releases the Omer from being non-permissible to permissible. But it also means that once it's been matir, there's no prohibition whatsoever to offer a sacrifice from the new grain. Rather, the optimal, but if we're looking for the most optimal way to do something, not that there is a prohibition anymore, but if we're looking for the most optimal way to give the to use grain, we wait till the Shtei HaLechem has been given at Shavuot time, and therefore that we allow that the Shtei HaLechem, the two loaves, be the first offering of the new grain, and therefore optimize and make the new grain as if it's being elevated to its highest level. Therefore, it follows that if we want to do things, if we think about that we want to do in the from the aspect that for our private use, we can, we've been matir, we've released the grain for private use. But for the temple, which we want to have the most exemplary type of activity, we'll wait and we won't use the first grain till the opportunity of being the sacrifice of the two loaves. The two loaves are made out of wheat, and we use the grain, and we use the new crop of grain for the sacrifice of the Shtei HaLechem, the two breads, which are brought at the Shavuot time. Therefore, it follows that one should not even bring an offering of the grain prior to the new loaves, not because there's something inherently wrong, because we've already changed the status of the new grain. But what we want to do is what we want to bring it. Want to bring the new loaves and use it in its most optimal time, and because the two loaves are not offered in their ideal state if it had been used prior to that. So there's three models, the way we can understand the prohibition of the not using the new grain, and this is what's called, and this is in the technical terms, what's called Chodesh, the new grain, and how to use that new grain in our use. Actually, it also has ramifications for our day-to-day use, and some people, even these days, certainly if you live in Israel, are very careful not to use the new crop before the 16th, before the Omer would have been brought if we would have a temple, which would be the 16th of Nisan. It doesn't affect anything of the Shavuot period because we don't have a running temple. Now, this concept that we've just discussed, right, is an interesting rule, and all our rules, all our teachings in the Torah, all our mitzvahs, they all have a deeper, mystical, spiritual interpretation, and that's what we're going to discuss in this part of the Sheaf. So every legal formulation that we have in the Torah has its corresponding spiritual application. Let's now think about and remember what the Omer offering was actually about, and what's the Sfiras Omer period about. Right? So, in a spiritual sense, the Omer period, the counting of the Sfiras Omer period, is the time when it reflects historically from when the time the Jews went out of Egypt till their receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. We are commanded to count this period of time, and the Jews were counting the days till they came to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. They were moving their sense, their psychological sense, from being in the psyche of being servants who had been serving the Egyptians. They now became freed men, but they were changing their psyche towards being free men till they would actually get their new constitution as a Jewish nation. So since they were moving from one psychological state to another new free man psychological state, they had to change their attitudes. Now we learn in Kabbalah that we have 7 emotive capabilities, and each one of those 7 capabilities are embedded in those same 7 in each one and each one of those inner subtypes has to be refined. So the Omer offering was brought from barley, which barley is the food for animal fodder. It's animal feed. This represents the idea that a person has to refine. A person has to feed his lower realms, his lower spiritual realms of his first, develop them till a person elevates himself to a higher level. The ultimate level at the end of this period of time is the food of man, wheat. So the two loaves which are brought in the Shavuot time are brought from wheat, which is what we consider human food. The Omer offering, therefore, points to this foundational spiritual refinement that a person has to go through, and to refine the person's baser animal instincts, and he works on them one by one, 7 weeks, and each one of those 7 weeks, 7 days, 7 times 7, 49 days, till he gets to 49. And then the 50th day, when he's ultimately gives the sacrifice of the two loaves, the highest spiritual order. The offering of the two loaves alludes to a self-transformation, a changing, a transcendence, that so that a person can begin to take a more deeper, more spiritual attitude towards spiritual work through usage of the Torah mitzvahs. The two loaves, the two loaves had other aspects to it, but the idea being that the loaves were encompassing, and the spiritual grain, the spiritual food, was an all-encompassing elevation that a person made himself. So part of the ceremony was to move the two loaves in all six directions, up, down, east, west, front, and backwards, meaning to say that I've elevated all my physical space, and I've elevated all my base arena into a more higher spiritual mode. So I've now developed and refined myself and my soul to a higher level. And further still, the two loaves allude to two aspects that I incorporate. I incorporate the what's written in the written Torah, and that reflects a person's acquiescence and agreement to everything that's written written in the Torah, and the oral Torah and the written and the oral Torah, the oral law, which is something which we understand and which we develop with further understanding. So it's the idea of integration of my submissiveness to God's mitzvahs, as well as my understanding of what I need to do. Now, we can understand this elevationary period by developing and understanding those three models that we introduced the class with, about how to allow the usage of the usage of the new grain, using those three models that we had before. So we can understand that a person has to elevate himself and move himself forward. And how does a person begin their spiritual work before they've refined, or in the process of refining themselves? So a person first has to start at his base level and look at his base level, whatever that might be, and then work upwards from that. So therefore, when we look at the idea of the new grain and how we allow the new grain to be used, we can understand it, that if the Omer is brought from anything else other than the lowest type of food, it's as if we're not starting. It's not starting from our most intrinsic base level, and therefore understanding that implies to us that we can't bring or we can't use in the temple our own spiritual temple, because every single person is a temple to himself. So that means we can't use the new crop or the new produce as yet, because I have to first refine myself at the basic level first, and hence the new grain offering wouldn't be accepted. But if I did do it, it won't be accepted after the fact, because ideally one should preface here any spiritual efforts with submission, that is a base level of what I need to do, submission to God's rules that grounds and orients his work towards God. But once I'm started on the path to that, I can then understand that I can potentially refine them, at least because I've got a secure foundation to build on. So let's move ourselves to that three conceptual ways of understanding the relationship between the Omer and the two loaves, and that in a way that says that I need to have three ascending levels of divine service. The conception that sees both prohibitions as truly one prohibition, as we started with. So let's review these the three models we said. We said that from one point of view, we should align ourselves or think about that the new grain can't be used, but that it is, if it is used in the Omer period, it's really two aspects of the one prohibition, and we said that the reason why it's allowed is because we said once it did get used in that Omer period, it's once started, it's okay, but prior to that you can't use it. So that was one model. The second model was that there was actually two prohibitions, two distinct prohibitions. One which you can't use. One, you can't use the new grain whatsoever, and then post the Omer, you can if it's used, it's okay. And the reason why is because we've just weakened the prohibition. And the third model was to say that really the only reason why we are allowed to use the grain, or what would the reason why we don't want to use the grain, is because we want to use the new grain in its highest, most optimum way. So now if we take those three ideas and try to map those three ideas to a person's personal service to God in the Omer period, the idea that the conception that sees both prohibitions as truly one prohibition is aligned with a psyche or a personality or a person who's just begun their spiritual journey. So to him, even spiritual work or any spiritual work is a perilous, difficult, fraught with misalignment potential, and because this person has just begun his spiritual journey, and to him, even spiritual any type of movement is a touch and go type of event, and therefore can lead himself down to perhaps not understanding or potential thinking a person's self is achieved everything without having done the original or prefaced it with whatever a person might need to prepare himself to come to the highest level of the two loaves. So, and the two loaves, in other words, are just as critical as the Omer into the spiritual newcomer. But after the fact, however, once the Omer has been brought, the animal within him has been weakened. So spiritual work can technically begin, although he hasn't fully gone to the highest level. So this is the idea that a person is not to use the new grain as yet, because even though he's allowed to use it for personal, but in his personal life, but he can't use it fully in his spiritual life. The second conception sees the two prohibitions as distinct, and the prohibition against offering from the new grain prior to the two loaves as being less severe, and is aligned with a person who is not concerned that he will fall in his spiritual level if he proceeds to the spiritual work without the submission of the two loaves, but it does enhance his divine service, and the loaves allow him to engage in his spiritual task with even greater selflessness and help him along. And then the third concept, which sees the two loaves not as permitting new grain offering, but rather that the two loaves should ideally be the first grain offering. That concept alludes to a person who wants to go to the highest, loftiest, most sublime circumstance where a person does not see his elevation as leading to some other worthy goal, but rather that the ultimate end of his spiritual work is his spiritual work itself, the ultimate achievement of what he's going to do. And then the two loaves, the unification of the written and the oral Torah, the cultivation of the humility, is coupled with his own selfhood, is itself the main event. And that this labor is brought from the first grain alludes to the fact that the good should be suffused and energized with all the positiveness of doing good work and delight, just like all first things should be done in the most positive and fullest manner possible. So here we have a beautiful concept that's written in Torah law, explained as a methodology of towards how a person might try to achieve their own spiritual elevation, and how a person can prepare himself herself for the giving of the Torah, for receiving the Torah in its fullest measure, the written law and the oral law. Okay, with that, I wish you a beautiful week, and we'll see you again at our next class. Ultimately, all our services that we do, and all our mitzvahs that we do, and all the Torah that we learn forge a stronger connection for ourselves to holiness and godliness. The period of the Omer, that is the 7 weeks of between spheres, the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuos, ultimately give us the potential to strengthen our connections to Hashem. One way is that through the counting of the Omer. Now, the counting of the Omer is called sphera, right? It's literally, it means to count, but it's also taught to us that the root of the word to count also actually means to shine. Where is that going with us? That through the period of the Omer, the Jewish nation, as an emerging nation, was given spiritual powers to allow them to improve themselves and go from a state where they were in bondage to feeling free men. So in relating to what I just said, that allows their own emergence of their own neshamas, their own souls, to come and to shine. Each day of that period allowed them to work on a different aspect of themselves as defined by the 7 emotive capabilities in the neshama, which we've spoken at length in previous times, and each one of those emotive capabilities broken up into 7 themselves. So that's 7 times 7, which is 49th day. In the agricultural sense, in the land of Israel, there was springtime, and then 7 weeks later, which was normally the harvesting time. So this idea of self-improvement of the individual was reflected in the physical aspect of the nation itself, in their agricultural sense, that in the springtime, the first crops of grain sprouted, and over the period till the 7 weeks, they came to their fruition as edible grain. In relation, and that's how the Omer period, on a personal psychological plane, gets reflected in the agricultural plane of the people while they are in the land of Israel, that they became they blossomed more. They went from the first grain, from the first produce appearing in the land, and coming to a full harvest. So therefore, the full harvest blossomed. Our class today talked about at what period of time do we start to use the capabilities of the new grain. So that was also reflected in the ceremonies in the temple. The first usages of the first grain was through the Omer sacrifice. On the spiritual sense, this is like to reflect the idea that in order to utilize our fullest capabilities, we need to go through a slow progression. So I can't utilize all my deepest capabilities at first. First, I need to have a base model. I need to have a base level of progression, so that just like you say, a person, a child doesn't run first. First has to you have to do the baby steps, and then you take the better steps till you stride and run. So in so in the same sort of way, the first initial crops and the first sacrifice was to first allow a person to utilize his capabilities and to improve himself on the most base level, that is at the barley level food for animals, because a person first is built up out of a base, a base person, base capabilities, simple emotions, till a person gets to the highest spiritual emotions of connecting, of connecting to God. But our ideas which we presented reflected that even if number one, but perhaps a person can't use any of his capabilities, and then what we just said, but if you did use some sort of spiritual, some sort of special energies that you have, right? You can't forget about your most base levels or other areas that you need improvement in, because in order to come to the fullest person, you need all of those areas to be developed. So what we said was that sometimes a person has to leave his personal characteristics and not develop every single thing of it at once, but first develop on a step-by-step process. Not that it's not allowed, but that you should do it in the best open and the most optimum way is to use your best energies for for Hashem Himself. Give you an example. One of the Rebbe's educational philosophies was that in a school day and in a Jewish school, the best hours of the day of the children should be used for Jewish education. So we know that just as general, when you work with people, that when the mind is fresh and the mind is had a good rest, right? So when you start your day off, you achieve optimal results in the first early hours of your working day, and then but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use all the hours of your day, but you're not developing the best of it. You're not utilizing the best of your resources at the end of the day. Rather, try to use the best resources at the beginning of the day. So, in relationship to that, right, one educational philosophy is that for the children, the best hours of the day to learn good Jewish values is at the early days of the school day, and then do other subjects like writing or maths or other things, secular subjects, at this second half of the day rather than the first half of the day. That way, you're utilizing your best fruits, your best capabilities for the ultimate of purposes. Does that mean that you at some times, or that you shouldn't do secular studies at the beginning of the day? Not necessarily. If you don't have your teacher's resources around at that time, there's good reason why you need to optimize the different hours of the different teachers for different things. But this just gives us an approach. So in relationship to what we are talking about the grains, the third approach, which we've talked about, the idea of not using the first fruits, but only waiting for the grain produce to be used in the temple, is the idea of leaving the best of the field or the best of the produce for the time when we've developed ourselves into the highest level. Does that mean that you can't, or that if I use energies or if I use the fruit prior to that time, that is prior to the Shavuot time, in the time between Pesach and Shavuot, that I've done the wrong thing? No, what we said was that it's not done. That's not okay, because once you're using your energies for God, so if you use it in the morning or in the afternoon, they're all okay. But the most optimum thing is to, as we said, sort of do it in the morning. So in the same sort of way, the first grain that was used was had to be barley. Once that had been achieved, you can then use your best, your good produce at other times, other periods of the time of that period. Once you've initiated the usage of the grain, then it's you can use it at any other time. You're allowed to use it, but we try to, if you want to use it in the most optimum, we use it and we delay it till to the ultimate of when we're going to use it for the first challahs. My own ideas. So just to give you another example, but this is something that I haven't seen in a text. It's just my own idea. This period of the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot goes through two extremes. In Pesach time, we're not allowed to use any leaven. We can only eat matzahs, right? At the end of the 7-week period, right, we're eating bread, and the sacrifice that we give in the temple is grain-based, is bread. Interestingly, if you take this as a spectrum of time, the first period of that 7 weeks period, first week is Pesach, where you can only eat matzah. Matzah represents the idea of complete submission to Hashem, and because the matzah itself is tasteless in theory, right, and that it's flat, it's not risen. The other extreme of the period, the time when we bring the Shtei HaLechem, the two challahs, there are two breads. They actually were two bread-like things. Bread, but in essence, is wheat that's been sown, and the wheat has risen to become a bread-based thing. In other words, the bread has a shape and a form. The matzah is flat; it doesn't have a form. The challahs has a form and an identity, and in fact, there isn't just one, but in fact, there is two. In other words, to say that on some sort of philosophical way, there isn't just oneness and everything the same. That's right at the beginning. So when we need total submission or agreement to change ourselves, you need to be like flat and just agree that I need to move myself ahead. At the end of the period, you become a developed entity. You have a form and an image, and you can even be multiple, right? So you can have two lechems. So at the base beginning of your period of spiritual improvement, for a person first has to be at a at a submissive level, accept all the mitzvahs, accept your teachings, accept everything, right? Work on your base understanding, and then after the first week, that is after the Pesach period has finished, you can then allow yourself to branch out and to investigate more and to develop yourself more till the ultimate point of Shavuos, right at the end of that 7-week period where you become an entity for yourself, but not an entity which is going against Torah, but a developed full person, in fact, to the state where you can even be two without contradicting the idea of one. You can have a person can got multiple different, let's say, thoughts and processes in his mind, and without and still be considered an integrated person. A person could be a developed idea. This is the same sort of idea of what was expressed in some sort of way. I think there's a similarity, a level of similarity to this idea that at first you have to start at the base level, at the oats level, animal fodder, just like you do in the army, base training. You can't go beyond what the sergeant or the people in boot camp tell you have to do. You have to rise at this time, go to sleep at this time, etc., and get yourselves done. Then, as you progress through the ranks further, then you can become more of an independent, more of an individual person, but keeping within the framework. So this is the idea. This is part of those models, that idea that at first level, the first level, we can see it as one prohibition, the prohibition that you can't go beyond. You just have to have oats. You can't have any wheat, any wheat-based thing. And then after you've progressed a little bit, once you've done it and you've experienced a little bit of more, in a positive sense, a little bit of growth, then you continue. Or you have the third model that we talked about, which was leaving the best, leaving the grain for only the last sacrifice, which is the Shtei HaLechem, and that's the optimum, using that grain for the best things in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple itself. So I think that's it's something, my own thoughts, but something which is like based on that same idea.